So, the next thing I want to do is introduce you to the topics that we're going to explore in this unit. And this is going to give you a sense of the sorts of areas that you can work in. I should say that I've mapped out some of these ideas in the book that that I wrote a couple of years ago that I'm highlighting here. You don't need to read it, but this is just where a lot of my ideas about media research are contained. But anyway, I'm going to be suggesting that we can do media research in some of the following areas: media rituals, media content, media policy, media places, media people, and media audiences. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through each one of those topics quickly and give you a sense of what they're all about. Let's start off with media rituals. Researching media rituals means looking at how people use media, not so much in terms of content, but in terms of form. That is, researching media rituals means looking at how people use media in everyday contexts and thinking about how that use of media actually creates particular ways of relating to the world and each other. That is, when we do things like use social media, we're not simply conveying information or ideas or gathering information and ideas. We're actually creating social relationships between ourselves, media companies, and other media users. So, what we're seeing in this way is that in using media, this is one of the places where we actively create the social relationships that give structure to everyday life. So that's one of the topics that we're going to be looking at. So that's what's involved in the study of media rituals. Media content, we're going to be looking a little bit at video games as an example of the way that accessing media content is a way of creating community. Really, what we're talking about here is how media content can be thought of as something which creates certain kinds of social knowledge and again becomes the basis for communicating important ideas about how the world works. And we're going to be studying that in relation to video games. And the interesting thing about video games is that it suggests that that media content is something which occurs across a range of different social locations. And in that sense, we begin to see how using media becomes a way of making connections between different aspects of the world. Media policy. One of the things we're going to be looking at is advertising regulation as a way of thinking through the deeply practical problems involved in regulating media industries. The question of whether media industries should be regulated, whether they're best left to regulate themselves, whether it's even possible to regulate media industries, even if we wanted to, and how best to achieve that. These are really important political questions, and they're questions that have been around for a long time and questions that have been puzzling people for a really, really long time. So what we're going to do is look at the topic of regulating alcohol advertising and marketing as a way of thinking through some of the more general practical problems in forming effective media policy. We're also going to be looking at what I've called here media places. One of the most interesting ways of researching media is to look at the relationship between media use and place. And in this particular unit, we're going to be looking at the topic of media sport. And we're going to be looking at how the phenomenon of media sport, we're actually going to be talking about the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, how that particular media industry has had such a profound effect that it's actually began to change the physical environment of the places that we live. In this case, we're going to be talking about how the practice of media sport has actually given the city of Melbourne a particular shape. And we're going to be looking at the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, as an example of how that shape shifting power of media industries comes into being. We're also going to be looking at thinking about media people, and what I mean by this is thinking closely about what the purpose is of studying media industries through the people who work within them. And this is a picture of a very famous woman war correspondent called Kate Adie. And Kate Adie is a really interesting figure because she allows us to think about how the forces of history and social institutions influence the nature of creative work. Kate Adie was one of the 20th century's most famous female war correspondents, most famous war correspondents of all time. But the reason I mention her gender is that her gender became a really important factor in thinking about how she was able to carve out a formidable career as a war correspondent within a particular institution, in this case the BBC, at a particular moment in media history. And the point is to let us think about how we can do research on media industries by finding the right people to talk to and study. How is it that if we choose the right people who work in media industries, we can use them as a kind of a vehicle to talk about how those industries work in general? And then finally, media audiences. We're going to talk about audiences, or we're going to talk about media users. There are different approaches to that. But what we're going to be looking at here is how people use media to act in the world. How is it that people become active in society through using media? And there are a variety of ways that we can approach this. But one of the things we'll learn here is that by identifying, again, the right groups of media audiences, by finding groups of people who are using media in particular ways, we can actually tell quite a lot about how media become the foundation for social life. The image I've got here is of some British audiences celebrating the royal family, and the example we're going to talk about is the concept of the royal family, how the royal family's capacity to attract an audience through media becomes an important part of their political power, but also in those practices, the practice of being an audience for the royal family represents a way through which people become politically active. So the question of media audiences is really a question of how people become active in society through using the media. So those again are broad topics, and each one of these represents a particular field through which we can demonstrate how media have a real effect on the social world.